On a freezing winter night in Cleveland, Ruth Harlan had nothing. Not the kind of nothing people mention when they mean they are short on cash. Real nothing. No home, no coat, only a torn blanket that had long ago stopped keeping any warmth inside it. She sat behind the loading dock of a drugstore on Lexington Avenue, the concrete so cold it burned through her jeans. She pulled the blanket tighter, though it had not helped in a long time. Then she heard it, a faint sound coming from the green dumpster nearby. Weak, almost nothing, yet not nothing. A cry. She stood and walked over. The lid was heavy and rusted at the hinges. She pushed it open with both hands and looked inside. There, in a plastic grocery bag tied loosely at the top, was the source of the sound. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the cold that had numbed her fingers long before. She untied the bag. Inside lay a newborn baby, only hours old, the umbilical cord still attached and tied off roughly with what looked like a shoelace. The skin had turned purple in places. The lips were blue. The cry was barely a cry anymore, just the sound a tiny body makes when it is fighting to stay alive and running out of reasons. The baby was wrapped in nothing more than a thin plastic bag and a hand towel. That was everything someone had decided this child was worth. Ruth stood there holding a dying infant in a parking lot on a brutal winter night. She had no phone, no money, no way to call anyone. A man sitting nearby against the wall had seen everything. He said, "Don't. Call 911. Hand it over. Walk away. That's not your problem." Ruth did not look at him. She looked at the baby. She looked at the torn blanket on the ground, the only thing she owned that still counted as something. She picked it up and wrapped the baby in it carefully, the way you wrap something when you know the wrapping is all you have. She tucked the edges under and pulled the child close to her chest. Now she had nothing. Not the kind of nothing she had minutes earlier, which was already almost nothing. Actual nothing. No blanket, no barrier between her body and the merciless cold. She knew she had only a short time before the cold would become dangerous. She was not new to it. She stood. The cold hit her at once, full and immediate. She held the baby against her chest and began walking toward the streetlight at the end of the block, toward a church she knew would be open. The wind came off the street with weight. Her arms shook. The baby had stopped crying. Not because it was better, but because it was too cold even to cry. She walked faster. She reached the church steps, pulled the door open with one hand while pressing the baby to her with the other. Inside, warmth met her. Not the warmth of a home, but the steady warmth of a building with heat and walls and a ceiling. Enough. Father Thomas was near the altar, rolling up a tablecloth from the evening service. He looked up and saw a woman standing in the doorway with no coat, shaking, holding something wrapped in a torn blanket. He did not ask what had happened. He walked toward her, saw the baby's face, and said, "Sit down." She sat. He went to the back room and returned with a donated coat, which he placed around her shoulders. Then he picked up the phone on the wall and called for help. This was procedure. A newborn found abandoned. You call, that is what you do. The ambulance arrived quickly. 2 paramedics took the baby gently, checked vital signs and temperature. One said the baby had mild hypothermia and needed time under warming lights at the hospital. He would be all right. Ruth looked at the paramedic and asked, "Can I come?" He looked at the way she was holding the empty blanket and asked if she was the mother. She said no, she had found him. He paused, then said she could ride along. She sat in the back of the ambulance beside the stretcher and watched the paramedic wrap a warming blanket around the baby. The siren stayed off. They drove through the quiet city streets on that winter night, the lights from houses passing like scenes from someone else's life. At the hospital, they took the baby inside. Ruth followed. At the desk, a nurse asked her name and her relationship to the child. Ruth paused, looked through the glass at the baby under the heat lamp and said, "I'm the one who was there?" The nurse typed something. Ruth sat down in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights and waited through the long, quiet hours of the night. No one brought her coffee. No one checked on her. No one told her she could go home because no one knew she had none. When the baby was stable, a doctor came out and told her the warming protocol had worked. The baby would be fine. Ruth nodded and said thank you. Then child services arrived. 2 people with clipboards and forms. They spoke with her for a long time. She told them everything: the dumpster, the bag, the cold, the blanket. They wrote it down. The woman said the baby would be placed in temporary foster care. They would take it from here. Ruth looked at her and asked if she could hold him one more time before they took him. They looked at each other. The woman said 5 minutes. They brought the baby to her. She sat in the plastic chair in the hospital hallway and held him. He was warm now, clean, wrapped in a proper hospital blanket that did what a blanket was meant to do. She held him close and said it very quietly. Not to anyone, not even really to him, because he was too young to understand. She said it to the air between them, the way you say things that need saying, even when no one is ready to hear them. She said, "You'll be okay." Then she handed him back and watched them carry him down the hall. The door closed. She sat in the chair for a while longer before she stood and walked out into the winter morning, still without a proper coat. The donated one remained on the pew where she had left it. She had no idea she had just spoken 3 words a boy would carry with him for years to come. Father Thomas made one phone call, not to child services or the city, but to a woman named Linda Chen, a legal aid attorney who took cases no one else wanted because no one else would. That was her whole practice. Linda met Ruth on a weekday afternoon in a small room with no windows and a table that wobbled on one leg. She had the file open before Ruth sat down. She looked at it, then at Ruth, and said she would be honest. No fixed address for months, no income, no history of caring for a child, no spouse, no family support on record. The odds were not good. Ruth did not flinch. She asked what she needed. Linda listed it: stable housing, steady income, foster parent training, a background check, a home inspection by a licensed social worker. All of it documented, all of it before the hearing. Ruth asked how long she had. Linda said the court date was set for several months away. Ruth nodded, stood, and said then she had better start. She named the baby Owen. Not after anyone. She simply liked the sound of it. She said it once out loud in the hospital hallway the morning child services took him, and it felt right. She held on to it the way you hold on to the one small part of a situation you get to choose. She applied for jobs. Several places said no. The gap in her work history, the years with no address. Then she was offered night shift housekeeping at the hospital. She said she could start that very night. She found a small studio apartment. The heat worked, the hot water worked. She stood in the middle of it on the first day and looked at the walls, white, clean enough, small enough that you could touch both if you stood in the center. She did not stretch her arms out. She simply stood there for a moment, then began cleaning. She attended every session of foster parent training, 4 hours every Saturday for several consecutive weeks in the basement of a community center. Fluorescent lights, folding chairs, a whiteboard that still said, "Welcome new foster families" in faded marker. She was the only one who came alone. She took notes because she wanted to remember everything. She filled notebooks. She did not miss a single session, not when she was sick, not when her shift ran late and she had almost no sleep. She showed up, sat in the folding chair, and took note. The social worker who inspected the apartment walked through in a few minutes. She looked at the borrowed crib Father Thomas had brought, the firm mattress, the new sheets from the dollar store, the formula and bottles and diapers on the counter, the modest food in the refrigerator. She wrote her report in the car. When Ruth saw it weeks later, one line stayed with her: minimal but adequate. She read it twice. She chose silence. Silence had carried her this far. The background check cleared. No criminal record, no history of violence or substance issues, nothing. The system had looked for a reason to say no and found only poverty. Poverty is not a disqualification, but it sits in the room during every hearing. Everyone can see it even when it has no line on the form. At the hearing, the judge asked why the court should grant custody to a woman who had no fixed address only months earlier. Ruth stood. She did not look at her attorney or her notes. She looked at the judge and said, "Because I showed up. Every hearing, every class, every time someone told me I couldn't." The room was quiet. Temporary custody was granted, with review in several months. It was not victory, it was a reprieve. She treated it as both. They brought Owen to her in the hallway. A woman from the foster family said he liked to be held on the left side. He slept better that way. Ruth took him and held him on the left side, a little tighter than usual, the way you hold something when you have spent months earning the right to hold it at all. She walked out of the courthouse, took the bus home with him on her lap, and watched the city pass outside the window. She was his mother now, not because the court said so, because she had shown up. In the years that followed, Ruth worked 2 shifts, the day shift at a laundromat that paid cash and the night shift at the hospital. She slept in the narrow gap between them. She dropped Owen at community daycare every morning. Every morning he cried. Every morning she walked out the door without looking back. Not because she did not want to, but because if she turned around, she would not make it out. She knew this about herself and planned around it. On Owen's first day of school, she called in sick for the morning shift and walked him the several blocks to the elementary school. He wore new shoes, not new from a store, but new to him from a church donation bin. They fit. That was what mattered. She stood outside the gate and watched the teacher take his hand. She watched them walk inside. The door closed. She stood there a little longer before turning and walking to work. When Owen asked why they did not have a car, Ruth, folding laundry on the bed, said, "We have legs. They work fine." He said another boy's mother had a car. She said, "That boy's mother doesn't have you." He looked at her and did not ask again. Even at that age, he knew it was the best answer she had, and that it was true. At a parent-teacher conference, the teacher asked if there was anything about Owen's background they should know. Ruth looked at her and said, "He's a good kid who does his homework." That was all. She did not mention the dumpster or the cold night or the blanket or the hospital or the months of classes and background checks, and a social worker writing 2 words that had almost defined her. Owen brought home a certificate for Most Improved Reader, gold border, his name in the center. He handed it to her like something he was not sure about. She put it on the kitchen wall with tape. It fell the next week. She taped it again. It fell in early spring. She taped it again. The third time she used 2 layers. It stayed. It was still there years later, edges curling, gold border faded, tape yellowed. She never took it down. The old blanket remained in a cardboard box under the bed, folded inside the box that had once held canned goods from the food bank. Ruth never moved it, never washed it, never explained it. Owen found it once while looking for a lost shoe. He pulled the box out, opened it, and asked what it was. From the kitchen, Ruth said, "Just an old blanket." He looked at the torn, thin fabric, the kind of thing you would throw away without thinking, and put it back. He pushed the box under the bed and didn't ask again. That was the unspoken agreement between them. The things in the box under the bed did not need explaining. They were there because they were there. That was enough. Owen knew Ruth was not his biological mother. He had known for as long as he could remember. She never hid it. She never made it a speech or a careful talk on the couch. She told him the way she told him everything, straight, simple, without decoration. She said, "I chose you." When he asked what that meant, she said, "It means I didn't have to, and I did." He thought about that for a long time, at odd moments, in class, on the bus, at night before sleep. The idea that someone had looked at the situation, the odds, the cost, and chosen to stay anyway, not because they were obligated, because they decided. He did not fully understand it yet. He would, but not for a long time. Not until he sat in a courtroom years later, reading a file with her name on it, and felt the full weight of what choosing someone actually costs. As a teenager, Owen began going to the public library after school, not for homework, but for the law section on the third floor. He read about custody law, foster care statutes, tenant rights, eviction procedures, not because anyone told him to, but because he had watched his mother navigate those systems since he was old enough to sit in waiting rooms with clipboards and questions that always felt like tests. He sat at a library table with a legal dictionary open beside him, looking up words, writing them in a notebook he kept in his backpack. He did not tell Ruth about the notebook. She found it once on the kitchen table, opened it, saw words like adjudication and termination of parental rights, closed it, and put it back without a word. One evening while she was making rice at the stove, he said, "The system isn't broken." She looked at him. He said, "It works exactly the way it was built to work. That's the problem." She looked at him for a long moment and said, "When did you get so smart?" He said, "I watched you." She turned back to the rice and stood a little straighter at the stove, the way you stand when someone has seen something in you that you were not sure was visible. On a quiet weeknight, homework done, dishes in the sink, Ruth washing them with the water running, Owen sitting at the table said, "Why did you keep me?" Her hands stopped moving. The water kept running. She said, "Because someone had to." He said that was not an answer. She said it was the only one she had. He looked at her. She turned back to the sink. The water ran. The plates clinked. Neither spoke again. The conversation ended the way most important ones do. Not with a conclusion, but with a pause neither knew how to fill. He would ask again years later in a courtroom, and she would give a different answer. But that night the answer she gave was the one she had, and he accepted it the way you accept something you know is incomplete, yet also true. Years later, on graduation day from high school, Ruth sat in the last row of the small gym, the back, the edge, the place where you can see everything, and no one notices you. She had learned that position long ago and had never unlearned it. They called his name. He walked to the front, shook the principal's hand, took his diploma, and looked out at the bleachers. He could not see her. The back row was too far and the lights were in his eyes. But she could see him. She could see his hands. The same hands she had held in a hospital hallway years earlier when they were purple from the cold and barely moving inside a torn blanket that no longer kept anything warm. Those hands now held a diploma. She did not clap loudly. She did not stand. She sat in the last row and watched, thinking of the dumpster, the cold night, the grocery bag, and how those same hands had once been wrapped in her only blanket. Owen went on to college, then to law school on scholarship after a professor saw promise in a paper he wrote about tenant rights. He worked part-time at a legal aid office. He was good at it. He was busy. He called Ruth every couple of weeks, then less often, not because he did not care, but because he was building something, and the building took everything. The people who raised you become the people you call when you remember to call. Ruth understood. She had raised him to leave. That was the whole point. You raise someone to go, and then they go, and the room grows quiet. Every time he called, she said the same two words, "I'm fine." He believed her because he needed to. The alternative was to worry, and worry would not change anything. Then, her position at the hospital was eliminated after many years of night shift housekeeping. She had known every floor, every supply closet, every elevator that stuck. She received 2 weeks of severance and information about unemployment benefits. She put a chipped coffee mug, a photo of Owen on his first day of school, and a spare jacket into a box, and walked out for the last time. She began looking for work the next week. She was older now with no degree and no certifications. Her entire work history was one line: hospital housekeeping for many years. She applied to several places. 2 called her back for interviews. One manager looked at her age and said they needed someone who could handle the physical demands. She said she had cleaned a hospital for many years. He said he would be in touch. He was not. The other offered a trial shift. She worked it. They said they would call. They did not. Rent fell behind for the first time in all the years she had lived in the small studio. She had never been late. Not when Owen was a baby and formula cost more than expected. Not when the hot water heater broke and she paid for it herself. But now, after months with no steady work, the unpaid amount grew, along with late fees that made the hole deeper. An eviction notice arrived. The hearing was set for several weeks away. Ruth arrived at the courthouse early, wearing a white button-down shirt she had ironed on the kitchen table because she owned no ironing board, black pants, and black shoes that were old but polished with a rag and a little cooking oil. They looked cared for, the way everything in her life looked. Not new, but cared for. She sat in the second row, hands on her knees, purse on the floor beside her feet. She did not fidget. She sat the way she always sat in rooms where decisions were made about her life. Still upright, present. The landlord's attorney presented the case clearly. Months of unpaid rent, notice served, no payment since. The numbers were clean. The law was on the landlord's side. When asked if she wished to respond, Ruth stood. She had no legal pad, no notes, only her hands at her sides and the truth. She said she had lost her job at the hospital after many years. She had been looking for work since then and had not found anything yet. She was not asking the court to forgive the debt. She owed it and knew she owed it. She was asking only for more time. That was all. The young judge behind the bench looked at her. A professional look. The look a judge gives when weighing what has been said against the law. But something in her voice, the calm way she said, "That's all." Not pleading, not performing, not angry, just flat and steady, stirred something in him. Not recognition yet, something older. A rhythm in the way she spoke that his body recognized even though his mind did not. It was like hearing a melody you know but cannot name. He called a recess. In the small room behind the courtroom, he opened the old adoption file that had been pulled at his request. He read the name of the adoptive parent, Ruth Harlan. He read the date of the adoption years earlier. He read the CPS intake notes from the original file. Infant found abandoned in a commercial dumpster behind the drugstore on Lexington Avenue on a freezing winter night. Retrieved by a civilian identified as Ruth Harlan. No fixed address. Infant transported to the hospital with mild hypothermia. Civilian accompanied the infant. Civilian not related. Civilian stated she found the infant while seeking shelter and heard crying from the dumpster. He read the line twice. He closed the file and sat very still. The woman in the courtroom, the woman with no lawyer who owed a sum of money and had asked only for more time in the calmest voice he had ever heard, was the woman who had found him in a dumpster on that brutal night. She had taken off her only blanket and wrapped it around him. She had carried him through the freezing cold with nothing covering her own body. She had sat in a hospital hallway through the night. She had fought the system for months. She had worked 2 jobs. She had walked him to school. She had taped a certificate to the wall 3 times until it stayed, and now she was sitting in his courtroom, waiting for him to decide whether she got to keep her home. He knew what he had to do. Judicial ethics required him to step aside when impartiality could reasonably be questioned. There was no gray area. He returned to the bench and announced that the court was recusing itself due to a conflict of interest. The case would be reassigned. A continuance of several weeks was granted. The landlord's attorney objected to further delay. The judge said the continuance stood. Court was adjourned. After the room emptied, he asked Ruth to stay a moment. She sat back down. When they were alone, he stepped down from the bench, removed his robe, folded it carefully, and set it aside. He walked around the bench and sat across from her at the table. Level, eye to eye, no one above anyone else. He asked if she knew who he was. She said he was the judge. He was quiet for a moment, then reached into his pocket and took out a small, faded photograph. The edges soft from years of handling. One corner folded, colors faded. It showed a woman standing in front of a studio apartment door holding a small child. The woman was not smiling the way people smile for cameras. She was smiling the way people smile when they do not know anyone is watching. He set the photo on the table between them. Ruth looked down at it. Her hand came up slowly and touched the edge. It was shaking, not from weakness or age, but from the effort of holding something very large and very still inside herself. She said his name like a question that was not really a question. It was a word she had not said to anyone in a long time. Saying it now cracked something open she had kept closed for years. She did not cry. She put her hand over her mouth and stood very still, the kind of still that comes when you are afraid that if you move, the thing in front of you will turn out to be something you only imagined. He asked the question he had asked years earlier at the kitchen table. Why had she kept him? She was quiet for a moment, choosing between the easy answer and the real one. After all the years, she decided the real one was the only one that mattered anymore. She said, "Because you were real and I needed something real." He did not speak. There was nothing to explain. The sentence sat between them like the photograph on the table. Small, worn, true. She looked at him and said he looked like he ate enough now. He laughed. A short, unexpected sound that arrived before he could decide if laughing was appropriate. It was exactly appropriate. The most appropriate sound either of them had heard all morning. The laugh faded. The room grew quiet again, but a different quiet now. Not the quiet of strangers, but the quiet of two people who had found each other in a place where neither expected to be found. He asked if she still had the blanket. She said it was in a box under her bed. It had been there all the years since that night. He said she had kept it. Not a question. She said it was the only thing left from that night. Everything else was gone. The church, the hospital. Father Thomas had passed years earlier. She stopped. She did not need to finish. The apartment was the reason she was in this courtroom, the home where the blanket waited in its box. If she lost the apartment, she lost the place where the blanket was safe. He heard what she did not say. He said she was not losing that apartment. She looked at him and said he could not do that. He was a judge. It was a conflict. He had already said so himself. He said he knew. That was why he had recused himself. He was not doing this as a judge. She asked then as what? He said as someone who owed her everything. She looked at him for a long time. The fluorescent lights hummed. The old building settled with a quiet creak. She said she had given him a blanket. He said no. She had given him a life. The room was very quiet. The photograph lay on the table between them. The blanket waited in its box blocks away. The eviction notice lay on a kitchen table beside a certificate that said, "Most improved reader," still taped to the wall with 2 layers of tape. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say that the silence was not already saying. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is more than enough. Sometimes that is everything.